Okay, recording's on.
All right.
So we were talking about the 15-minute lost footage with Champawamba. So before we start the interview, this was the 15-minute lost footage. So I was I was telling Dambert every time when I read book, like say for example from Noam Chomsky, the book is so thick. I gotta have a dictionary right next to me. And I was going, fuck, I don't understand all these words and like a couple pages. We were joking around. I was going, it's so fucking hard stuff to read some of the books. So I was telling him, a while back, you heard of Anarchist Black Cross, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, from LA. Lane used to give me one-on-one workshop on fucking everything because some of the books were so fucking hard, and I have to always have a dictionary. So that was a conversation that got lost. Oh, another interesting that Danber didn't know. Maybe you could answer this too. The big circle A, the anarchy sign. So I was going through all the Spanish Revolution books, all the old books. I cannot find that symbol. Where did that symbol came from? Did it came from punk rockers, from Sex Pistols, or did it came from where did it came from? The circle A.
I'm not sure.
Know?
It definitely there's open debate.
Well, actually, I don't even know. Even the Sex Pistol time, they didn't even. Did they circle the A in Sex Pistols too?
No, no. It was definitely around in the 60s, and it probably came from that.
So from the 60s, like it came from the 60s then, the circle A.
It may have preceded the 60s, but it was definitely around in the 60s.
Okay, all right. Well, I mean, we'll find out someday in the future because I was going through all the photos. Where the fuck did that symbol came from? All right, Ramsey. A lot of people don't know this, especially in California, that you come from a band, Political Asylum, that started in 1982. Am I correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yes. The band started in 1982, so it took you 3 years to release a 7-inch on Children of Revolution 7-inch, right? EP. Yeah. Why did it take that long from 82? So you released something in 1985.
We released before that 7-inch. We released two albums on cassette. So we were part of that whole kind of anarcho-punk DIY culture. Though it has to be said that the term DIY is a great misnomer. DIY stands for do it yourself, and actually, which makes it sound like the kind of American capitalist ideal of strong people doing it themselves. Actually, the DIY culture was a very collaborative, cooperative. I mean, it should really be called DIT, I guess, doing it together.
I like DIT better.
With other people. But we were part of that whole punk underground so-called DIY scene. And one of the many aspects of that was music was exchanged typically by trading cassettes. And many people did kind of formal releases on cassette. I believe Chumbawamba's first release was on cassette on their own Sky and Trees label. And so everyone was doing it. They were releasing demos, they were releasing albums. I mean, they were called demos at the time. So in 1983, we went into the studio and recorded maybe 15 tracks. It was pretty much 60 minutes. It was our first time ever in the studio. It was called Fresh Hate. And we released that as an album or a demo or whatever you want to call it. It had a cover and whatnot. And through that kind of punk underground economy, I guess you'd call it, we sold thousands and thousands and thousands of that cassette.
Were you like dubbing it from the machines?
So we had a cassette player that had 2 cassettes on it. So we were dubbing it ourselves. We then also would give masters to basically just a copy of the cover and of the, a good quality copy of the cassette, to a bunch of other tape labels. So they release it as well. Of course, no one ever paid us, which was absolutely fine. But as a way of kind of disseminating and distributing our music, it was fantastic. But also in those days, cassettes and demo tapes were actually taken seriously. Meaning I would go to the record stores at the time, and they would sell them for us. So I would go to both, record stores like Rough Trade, which still exist, and they would take them on consignment. And I was also doing the early days of distribution, so I'd also take them, fanzines and pamphlets, whatever. But meaning that because of the vast size of this kind of punk underground, it wasn't weird. Like record stores were not like, what the fuck is this? Being a cassette. And in fact, occasionally much more major labels or bigger labels would release cassettes, a cassette only release. And because it became so ubiquitous, in those days, it wasn't like, these days albums are released on, well, typically now it's downloaded on vinyl, but 10 years ago it would be on CD and maybe limited edition vinyl. Well, again, back in the 80s, stuff was being released on vinyl and cassette. So again, the concept was not a strange concept. In 1984, we went into studios again and did a second demo called... I can't remember.
That's many years ago.
It was not called... I can't remember.
It's okay.
Anyway, it was another, and I think that time we only recorded 6 or 7 tracks in the studio. So basically, we spent a lot more time. So those songs sounded a lot better in many ways. And then we filled up the rest of the 60-minute cassette with a couple of live recordings, which again, in those days were done by typically sticking a boombox at the back of the hall and pressing play and record. And occasionally you'd get stuff recorded through the mixing desk, which again in those days had cassettes. So when we came to do, the 7-inch on Children of the Revolution records, because we played a big gig in Belfast, which was actually the founding gig of the Warzone Collective. It was a big benefit, which raised a bunch of money for them. And they used that to start the Warzone Collective. And there was a bunch of pretty big anarcho bands at the time. There was Disorder were playing, Subhumans, Political Asylum. We were not one of the big bands at the time. But anyway, we were on a bill with a bunch of bands. And Tim, the guy who ran Core Records, was over with Disorder. And he saw us play and was blown away. And after we came off stage, he ran up to us and said, do you want to do a record? And because he had a very thick kind of Bristol accent, we had no idea. We had also had very thick Scottish accents at the time. And we had no idea what he was saying. So I thought he was saying, do you have a record? And I said, no, we don't have any records, but we've got these demo tapes. And I sold them. I sold him a bunch of tapes. And then, fortunately for us, we all ended up staying in the same apartment or whatever it was in Belfast that night. So we stayed in the same place as Disorder. So Tim was also there with Disorder, and he said, so finally we could sit down and talk to him. And we finally made each other understood. And he said, do you want to do a record? And we said, okay. And so we went to the studio again and recorded actually 3 of the songs which were on that first demo tape, Fresh Hate. We re-recorded them. And Tim didn't really like it very much because he thought it was too produced. The production was too
clean recording?
Well, because again, this is only the 3rd time ever in our lives we've been in the studio, so we were still kind of playing around with stuff. We were discovering new things. We were just little kids. And so we actually used a drum machine instead of a drummer.
Oh, wow.
anyway, he didn't really like it.
It was interesting because when I first got the 7-inch, before I even listened to the music, I just saw Children's of Revolution, the core record label, because I was used to Chaos UK, Short Shop Shock stuff. Back then I was going, oh, wow. Then I played it. I go, wow, this is very different. Because I was accepting something like Short Shop Shock, but the Political Asylum music was very different than any other punk bands. Because back then, like what you said, Disorder, Chaos UK, they were so fast and heavy and stuff. And you guys were very different. What was your musical influence?
Well, I was the only punk rocker in the band.
Oh, really?
So the main, I mean, that's not true later on, but basically at that time, the bass player and the guitarist were two of my friends from high school, and they were both into heavy metal and rock music.
Oh, wow.
And it was me and the guitarist that wrote all the music. So basically, as little kids, when we were in high school, that's me. And that's the guitarist. Obviously, that's the heavy metal guitarist, and you can see the bass player's elbow. So as you can see from the way that those two look, they are not, they're not punk rockers. And in fact, but they were really good musicians, particularly the guitarist. So basically, as we were little kids growing up, we spent a lot of time in each other's bedrooms, and
keep talking. I'm just showing pictures while you're talking.
I'm trying to think of who the fuck that is. That is me. All right, there you go. So yeah, we spent a lot of time in each other's bedrooms playing each other music. So basically, he introduced me, and again, when I say we're little kids, so we're like, this is aged 14, 15.
Wow, 15. That's very young.
I mean, I think we were 15 when we started the band. So we were friends in high school. So we were listening to music together. So obviously before we formed the band, we were friends, and so basically I introduced him to punk rock, and he introduced me to kind of rock and metal. And the thing that we basically had in common was the kind of melodic side of things. So I introduced him to the likes of Black Flag, or I was very much into American music, even as a little kid. So I introduced him to Black Flag, or I can't remember the names of bands anymore. And he introduced me to bands like Rush or Trust, who are this fantastic political heavy metal band who basically sound like AC/DC, but with very, very political lyrics. AC/DC, so he introduced me to kind of punk and metal, and I introduced him to whatever. But we were always a bit strange because, on stage, I was the one that kind of looked like a punk. And they would be wearing, Status Quo t-shirts or Saxon or, and at the time in the early mid 80s, this is before Crossover. This is before, bands like DRI or COC, particularly in Britain. Punk and heavy metal there was no connection. They were kind of rival youth cults primarily. And so we were this strange amalgam. We were the kind of only band. We were kind of like Motorhead. Well, we were really unlike Motorhead, but we were like Motorhead in that it was okay for punks to like Motorhead for some reason. Whereas we actually preferred Hawkwind, probably, which of course Lemmy from Motorhead started out in Hawkwind. But it was kind of okay. So people liked us because we were kind of melodic, and we had this phenomenal guitarist who could play all these incredible solos and whatnot. I mean, that was obviously part of our music. And I remember reading in one fanzine when Discharge recorded Grave New World, which was their attempt to go metal. Of course, it was a horrendous record, one of the worst records ever recorded. And they were criticized for it, quite rightly, by everyone. Again, in the fanzines and the music presses. So this was like 1984 or 1985 at this point. And I remember reading a fanzine like, how come no one criticizes Political Asylum for having guitar solos? Anyway, it was weird, but we were accepted sort of by the punks. But it was also strange in that because we were in Scotland and we were in a small, when we started, we were in a small town in Stirling, where we were from, and then later on we moved to Edinburgh, but which is just the nearest big city. So that's why we moved to Edinburgh when we left high school. So when we were like 16, 17, we moved to the nearest big city. But because we were kind of pretty isolated and because we were really young, from almost the day that we started, virtually all of the gigs we played, we were the headliner.
Wow.
Again, not necessarily because we were popular, but we were kind of doing it ourselves. So, we were organizing our own gigs, and hence we either played with other friends of ours, or we were the only band playing because we didn't really know anyone else, or we'd play with bands from other genres who are also from Stirling, from this small town in Scotland. So we'd play with, a psychobilly band, or we'd play with a rock band, just because, it wasn't a... We were the only punk band in Stirling.
That's really interesting, because I was searching all the old photos of Political Asylum. I didn't really notice that you were the only punk. It's just because of the banners, because you guys have banners in the background. So I didn't really focus on that because all the backdrop banners and stuff that you guys have and stuff. But you were talking about Warzone Collective. Is that Warzone Collective still around, or is it gone a long time ago?
I think it's gone a long time ago now, but they were again inspired, like a lot of us, were inspired by that kind of DIY ethic and through Crass and likewise. And so I think the money raised from that gig, the gig was actually at Queen's University in Belfast. So it was a big gig with, a lot of people there. And I think they used it to get a venue. To get a physical space, a building, which they had for many. I don't know, maybe the building is still going. But they were around for, I think, a couple of decades, I think.
Wow, that's cool. Also, I was reading in the book The Day the Country Died that you went to like Zigzag Squawk gig, and you were actually in 1982 you had a table set up selling zines and distributing zines. Do you remember that?
I do, and actually I was not. It wasn't me that had, it wasn't me that had a table. So again, not again. I started as part of this punk underground. I was selling demo tapes. I was selling zines. I guess I was selling zines and pamphlets before the demo tapes. But in 1982, Crass and a bunch of other bands, it was basically kind of like a who's who of anarcho-punk then, squatted this old rock venue called the Zigzag. It was a big club, set up as a rock club, so a big stage and whatever. So it was Crass and Conflict and Dirt and Zounds and the Mob, and basically anyone who was anyone played at the time, or certainly with the kind of London bands, Flux, Peak Indians, whatever. And I happened to be in London, and went to the gig. I got into punk in 1979. When I was 13 in 1979, and I got into punk and politics at the same time.
I have to say, you look so good for your age, because that's a lot of I'm glad you're mentioning all this. A lot of people in California don't know this. When you have you're still tabling. We're gonna get to that way later on. But also, you had one of the members from Apostles played in your band. Chris.
He played in Political Asylum long before he was in the Apostles. But yeah.
Oh, he played before Apostles.
He was the drummer on that first demo, Fresh Hate.
Oh wow! Did you guys ever play live with the Apostles?
No.
Or anything ever? Oh wow! Okay, you played with one of my favorite band too from Scotland, The Alternative. Do you remember them?
I do remember them very well.
I love their album. Tell me some stories about the alternative. Didn't the singer pass away a while back? I forgot her name, but didn't she pass away?
I don't know.
Okay, tell me about the alternative. I love that band and I love that album. If they treat you like shit, oh god, I forgot the title. I used to have it a long time ago, but
if they treat you like shit, act like manure or something like that.
Yes,
or
I love that.
So the alternative were this band from Dunfermline. Dunfermline was maybe about an hour away on the train from Edinburgh, fairly close to Edinburgh. It was kind of north of Edinburgh. The alternative kind of viewed themselves as the kind of Scottish equivalent of Crass. So they were very, they all dressed in black, and they kind of viewed themselves as the kind of fathers of the anarcho-punk scene. So in many ways, they were inspirational. In many ways, they were also very patriarchal. They viewed themselves as not the fathers of the punk scene, but as the kind of patriarchs of the punk scene. So they tended to be very judgmental. They tended to be very... so they didn't really like us very much because, one, we didn't all dress in black and look like punks. And so again, in the early 80s, in the UK, youth culture was very, very, very divided. So as I said earlier, punks didn't really hang out with heavy metalers. And, famously because of the Exploited song, punks didn't get on with mods.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Skinheads, there was a very kind of uneasy relationship with skinheads. They were all these very, very rival kind of youth cults. Right. And, Britain is a very violent place, has a very violent kind of youth culture. So in many ways, it's just another excuse to fight. Now, punks also was very violent, and punks fought amongst themselves as well. And, just because you were a punk didn't mean that you lived, so punks would fight each other because they came from different towns or from a different area in the same city, or they supported a different soccer team or whatever. So anyway, at the same time, the early anarcho scene was incredibly self-righteous and incredibly judgmental.
Really?
Wow. And the big issue for punks at the time in the early 80s was animal rights. It was actually very, very kind of single issue oriented. They didn't have a broader picture. And the two big things were kind of peace, or being anti-war, and being a vegetarian. And again, much of this was driven by people just kind of copying Crass. That's why everyone dressed in black. That's why everyone had to be a vegetarian and be anti-war, etc. Now, again, we were always very honest. And we were very accessible, and we were very unusual. So I said we were a big part of this kind of whole punk underground, and we were actually we were actually fairly popular. Meaning, again, I say we sold more demo tapes of those early couple of tapes than many bands sold records. We probably sold, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000 of that first demo tape.
Wow. That's crazy.
We were selling. Let me put it another way. We were a big underground band. And because of those tapes, even though we had no records out, I say we could play gigs all over the UK. We could get 100 or 200 people would come and see us, despite not having a record, despite getting no mention anywhere, except in fanzines and anyway, part of the power of the underground. I say the alternative were incredibly self-righteous. So because we were very honest, and we were interviewed in literally hundreds and hundreds of fanzines, and in those days, of course, it was all by mail. We were honest. It wasn't a big deal. We said we were honest that not all of us were vegetarians.
Okay.
And B, hence we would get picked on because the presumption was actually the people that didn't look like punks were the ones that were not vegetarians, and hence not, quote, following the rules of anarcho-punk. Actually, that wasn't the case. It was actually our drummer. It was our drummer and guitarist. For a while, we had two guitarists. when we moved to Edinburgh, there was still the two heavy metalers, and then there was actually a punk drummer and guitarist. And it was actually the punk drummer and guitarist who were not vegetarians. The two heavy metalers were actually vegetarians. But again, it's kind of irrelevant. It wasn't a big deal for us. But we were criticized for not all being vegetarians. We were criticized by the alternative for not all being vegetarians. And we were criticized because, we looked different or whatever. And people made assumptions based on the way we looked.
You guys were minors too, right? Like 16, 15 back then?
We were what, sorry?
Minors.
Yeah, kids,
young.
Yes.
Also the age gap too. You guys are very young.
Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting.
But I'd say we were fairly popular. So we played, and for some reason, we were incredibly popular with skinheads. Again, many of whom were patently not nice people. Many of whom were covered in Nazi insignia and whatever. But they really liked. So we played this big gig in, again, somewhere north of Edinburgh. And again, because we were little kids, we had to go everywhere by train. We were not old enough to drive, let alone rent a vehicle. Well, none of us knew how to drive. We were little kids. We were teenagers. So anyway, we went everywhere by public transport, in effect. We did our first kind of tour by public transport. We took buses, the equivalent of the British equivalent of Greyhound, called National Express buses, and we toured around. Now, at the time, Mars Confectionery, that make Mars bars, had this deal where if you cut out little coupons on Mars bars and stuck on this label, you'd get cheap bus tickets. So we would just go through the trash cans and use Mars. So we actually financed our first tour in 1985 with these candy wrappers. But at the same time, there was a big campaign against Mars, because Mars, of course, like any confectionery company, were experimenting on animals. And so there's this big campaign against Mars. So again, we were accused of being hypocrites. We were accused of being whatever, because we used these candy wrappers, these coupons, clipped from the candy wrappers. And again, we would patiently explain that we didn't actually like Mars bars or eat them. We were just getting them out of the trash. And secondly, we try to point out the kind of class differences going on here. We were a bunch of working class kids from small town Scotland. And we couldn't afford to, A, we didn't know how to drive, but B, even if we could, we couldn't afford to rent a van. We're fucking kids, unemployed, we're kids on the dole. We don't have the ability to do any of this stuff. And we're being criticized by a bunch of people who have the luxury of having jobs. This is in a time in the early 80s where unemployment in Scotland was 25%.
Wow. Okay.
This is in the early 80s. So again, we kind of gently pointed out to people like the alternative that they were being a little hypocritical, shall we say, in their attacks on us. And of course, alternative didn't like that, so they didn't like us.
Oh, wow.
And would, publicly, whatever, criticize us, whatever. And again, we didn't really give a fuck. But it transpired that we played this big gig in somewhere with the alternative. So the alternative were the headliners and we were the band below them. And again, because we were quite popular with skinheads, there was like 100, 150 skinheads were there at the gig. It was probably skinheads that were punk. Yeah.
150. Fuck. That's crazy.
Like a lot of skinheads.
Were they cool skinheads or the crazy skinheads?
Crazy skinheads.
Oh, man.
And the skinheads all sat down in front of the stage. So the bands that played before us, the skinheads would like stop people dancing, whatever. So when we come on stage and we're kind of tuning up. So again, remember, our bass player and guitarist have got long hair. I remember this gig very well. Our bass player was wearing a Saxon t-shirt and had on like a kind of leather, like a waistcoat, like a sleeveless, like a denim jacket type thing, but it was leather and it was brown. It looked horrible. But anyway, there's all these skinheads, like rows and rows of them, 3 or 4 rows of skinheads, like sitting right in front of the stage. So our bass player, with his long hair and his Saxon t-shirt, walks up to the front of the stage and makes as if he's going to spit on the skinheads. And I'm like, oh Christ! Like, what are you doing, Norman? You know, we're going to get killed here. And we didn't spit. He just went up and like pretended to spit on them, and then wandered back. Anyway, we start the first song, and the skinheads all get up and start dancing, doing that kind of stupid skinhead dance. Anyway, so the skinheads loved us. And when we got off stage, they all came up and like bought our demo tapes and whatever. We then had to get the last train back to Edinburgh because the trains, you know, public transport, you know, usually stops about 11 o'clock, something before midnight. So we then left the show, you know, having sold hundreds of demo tapes to hundreds of skinheads. And we then learned afterwards that after we left, that the skinheads had assaulted and beat up the Alternative.
Oh.
Which we thought was kind of, at the time we thought it was fucking funny, actually. But I guess looking back, it was a bit ironic, shall we say.
Did they went up on stage and beat them up?
I don't know. We weren't there. We'd left. We were told.
Right after you played, you just took off.
Yeah, we had to catch the last train home.
Oh, I see. So those skinheads, they don't read your lyrics? Do they like your message and stuff?
Don't know.
Or do they just like the music? just wondering.
I don't know.
But that's an interesting time because when I was reading the anarcho-punk history of anarcho-punk, it sounded like everyone was all united and all like helping each other and stuff. That's what I thought about the UK scene in the 80s.
No, it was full of petty rivalries, jealousies.
Wow, interesting.
I mean, it was pathetic. It is what it was. It was a bunch of little kids.
Like 15, 16, 17, that age, then, right?
Well, but again, the people in bands may have been older. But, you know, your typical audience,
right,
is the same audience as is typical for any music. I mean, it's, you know, your typical audience for most music is what, 15 to early 20s, maybe.
Wow, interesting. Also, you said you come from a working class. Back then in Scotland, was there like your neighbor? Was it like tough? Were there gangs, or how was it back then?
Well, as I say, Scotland was a very violent place. But that violence was normal, was commonplace. I mean, it was just part of life. I mean, I only saw Crass live once, and that was in Dunfermline. So it was a gig organised in part with the help of the Alternative. Now, I remember at that gig, so there was a lot of glue sniffing going on. I remember walking into the bathrooms and there was some guy brandishing a knife. I don't think in the early 80s, I don't think I ever went to a punk concert without there being a fight at the actual concert.
Really?
And again, so this, as I said, this is a fight between punks typically. This is not punks fighting someone else. And it was rare that there wasn't actually blood spilled. But this was just kind of normal. I'd say this was typical, you know, again, British culture is very, you know, there's a lot of alcohol. And where there's alcohol, typically there's going to be alcohol and loud spirits, shall we say, as well as loud music, often leads to violence. Wow. So, I mean, it was just part of... So, yes, there's lots of gangs. There's a lot of violence, typically around soccer, football. But equally, it could be where you lived, you know, people from different areas, which I guess would be the more typical thing of a gang. I mean, you know, the Exploited were from the same kind of council estate where 2 of the members of Asylum were from. And this Exploited had a big rivalry with punks from another town, so they'd often be fighting with the, you know, with Edinburgh punks against these. I mean, whatever.
Wow. Ramsey, I'm glad you tell me this because in the 80s, I had pen pals from England. They used to send me zines, literature, all kinds of stuff. So I always thought, wow, it must be an amazing scene up there, like united and everything's so cool. That's how I pictured it all this time, but reading books and all that stuff. But Ramsey, we're going to come back to political asylum. There's going to be some questions more, but we'll come back to that later. There's the other people have questions for your band, but okay, let's go through AK Press. You are the founder of AK Press Book. We don't need intro for AK Press Book because everybody knows about AK Press. Like, you guys also got the spoken word album by Mumia Abu Jamal, Noam Chomsky, Howard Zinn, not just for audio. How did you start at AK Press?
So AK started at the same time as my interest in punk, as I say. So in 1979, I was 13 years old, and I got into punk and a bunch of other music and politics. I'm not quite sure how So in 1979, I decided that I was an anarchist. Mm-hmm. And I had a fairly sophisticated view of what anarchism was at that point. I have really no idea how I came to that. My parents were not political, but my mother always encouraged me to read. And I grew up in a house of books. And I also grew up with my mother from some of my earliest childhood memories of being taken to the library. So it meant by the time I was, pre-teenager, I was, I'd go to the library every Saturday. And, I had 5 library cards. So I'd take out 5 books and I'd read them. And I used to read voraciously on all kinds of topics. And my mother was very good at kind of whatever my interests were. She kind of slipped me better books, shall we say. So as a preteen, I was really obsessed with war. And again, I read indiscriminately about war, whether it was, biographies of Napoleon or Julius Caesar or fucking Hannibal, or, kind of pulp literature about, Panzer divisions fighting on the Eastern Front, or books on American military aircraft from the Second World War. Doesn't matter. I just read. So my mother would start slipping me more kind of political books. So if you're interested in war, you should read Catch-22, or All Quiet on the Western Front, or The Good Soldier Schweik by Yaroslav Hasek. It's a kind of comedic novel about a First World War kind of resistor, if you like. So I think it was my mother's influence, and she also made me kind of read all the classics, so to speak, or the classics that a young person would be able to read. So I read kind of Animal Farm by George Orwell, or I read A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by that Russian guy. I can't remember his name. I read Albert Camus. I read, The Plague, which is rather relevant today, or The Rebel by Camus. But anyway, so I think it's probably by reading this kind of quality literature, is my guess, is how I decided I was an anarchist.
Wow. And
then because I was into punk, I'd never actually heard Crass. But one of the first things I did was I bought a Crass T-shirt, which of course would have been a bootleg even in those days, because Crass never made their own T-shirts. But it was in the local record shop and had a Crass T-shirt, and I bought the T-shirt because it had Anarchy, Peace and Freedom on it. And I thought, I'm into Anarchy, Peace and Freedom. And this is in 1979, so I thought, fuck. It'd be a bit embarrassing when I go to my high school wearing my Crass T-shirt and people are going to ask me, what are they like? And of course I wouldn't know. So I then went and bought a Crass record. My first Crass record was Stations of the Crass, which again came out in 1979. And I also bought Bullshit Detector 1, which I think also came out in 79.
Yeah, that's cool.
And I actually remember at the time thinking, the music's pretty shit.
Yes, it is.
But I like the ideas. So anyway, that was my introduction to anarcho-punk. But I say by then I was already into punk. I was already listening to the Ruts and the Damned and the UK Subs and Cockney Rejects and whatever. But anyway, so as I say, pretty much in 1979, when I decided that I was into punk and politics, shall we say, I dived headfirst into this punk DIY subculture and fanzines and whatever. And so very quickly I started selling fanzines and distributing literature and ideas, if you like. And that's what later became AK. So, as you said, so in 1982, I was at this. So what I also started doing is every school holiday, because I was a little kid, you know, I was 13, 14, 15, 16, still in school, in high school. I would, every school holiday, I would go down to London, because London was where it's at, man. But also London was full of these radical bookshops, these anarchist bookstores. So I'd hang around the bookstore. So at this gig in 1982, it wasn't me that had a table of literature. I was walking around with a plastic bag selling fanzines. So I was walking up to people at the gig saying, hey, mister, being a little kid, hey, mister, do you want to buy a fanzine? And the typical reaction in those days was, what's a fanzine? And say, oh, look, it's only 10p, and it's got, Crass and the UK subs are in it, and whatever. But at this concert, there was a table of literature at the back, and there was a bunch of guys, I think they were all men, sitting behind the table. And to me, they looked like a bunch of old fucking weirdos. They're actually probably only 10 years older than I was. To me, as a little kid, they looked like a bunch of these old fuckers, and they had some had big beards. And actually these people, it transpired, worked in this bookstore called Houseman's, which still exists in London, around the corner from King's Cross Station. And so I went up and talked to them, because even as a little kid, as I was already distributing literature, I decided that this was the way to do it. I was walking around kind of harassing innocent gig attendees while they were sitting behind a table full of literature. And even then I thought, this is the way to do it. I should be fucking sitting behind a table of literature. So I asked them, I peppered them with 1,000 questions. And they were very kind and very, gave me a lot of their time. And they, I discovered that they worked at this bookstore. So I then went to visit the bookstore. And so basically every school holiday, I'd go down to London, and I started staying with some of them in their squats or their council houses. And basically I started hanging around Houseman's. And that was my real kind of political education. It took me to the next level. Wow. And it was Houseman's then started. Houseman's at the time did publishing and distribution as well as having a bookstore. So they would start to give me stuff basically to sell. So I moved beyond kind of punk fanzines to actually selling more political literature, magazines, pamphlets, whatever. And also, because they were involved in publishing various stuff, they helped me kind of, again, guided me through the process of actual how do you publish stuff. So the first things that AK published was in conjunction with some of them, the books and pamphlets I did.
So AK was started there, not in America.
Oh, yeah. AK was started in the early 80s.
I always thought it was started here when you moved here.
Yeah.
So, oh, wow. So you started over there.
Yeah.
Wow. That is very interesting. We're going to talk about PM and everything later, but when you were doing AK, in the 90s, I used to put on small events, and you used to drive all the way down and table and stuff. Some of them were small, some of them were medium size. And I used to feel bad because it was at a coffee shop, cafe event, and you would come all the way from San Francisco, and it was a small crowd. I was going, man, I feel bad. You would come to the event, and you were so committed on coming to all these events and stuff. It blew my mind. And after that, I think the last event in the 90s, it was all the Aztec dance. So they invited you to dance and stuff. Do you remember that during the Solidarity Fest in LA? It was in the 90s with Subsistencia, and there was Aztec dance. So they told everybody to come dance. It was in a big hall, but it was kind of empty. And after that, I was going, man, I don't think I should invite Ramsey AK Press anymore, because every time they come to table, the event doesn't turn out that big. And I felt this so bad, but you were so committed coming down all the time to events like that. It's touched my heart and stuff during the AK Press. But tell us about your bookmobile. You guys were going to all kinds of events and tabling.
Well, I mean, it's well, I say obviously I was not the first person to do this. As I said, Houseman's Bookshop were tabling at a crash show in 1982.
Oh, okay, wow.
So it's not like that we invented the concept of tabling, or even tabling at rock concerts. I mean, to me, the philosophy has been twofold. One is I believe in the importance of ideas, and hence I want to distribute those ideas. So I'm going to try and distribute them in any way, in any form, in any medium, to anyone that's willing to listen or to read or whatever. At the same time, I want to do things that I'm interested in. So the reason that I'm going to table, so I'm going to drive all that way to LA for two reasons. One is because I think it's important. Secondly, it's a way of actually showing solidarity with the events that are happening beyond any commercial aspect. Thirdly, it's something that more or less I would like to be at. So in effect, I'm just following my own passions and interests. You know, if I really loved, I don't know, if I really loved reggae music, which I don't, or if I really loved hip hop, which I don't, these are just my personal music preferences, I would be tabling at reggae shows and hip hop events. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I like punk and I like folk music. So typically they are the events that I'll be tabling at. I mean, we actually do table at hip hop events and heavy metal concerts, whatever, but it's typically not me because I don't like it.
Right.
So I'm following my political passions or my political beliefs, but also I'm following my personal interests.
Right.
But I think it's actually really important to have literature at events. I say for two reasons. One is because I want to disseminate and distribute that literature. But secondly, if I think that literature is important, it's a way of showing solidarity with those events.
Cool. Right. Then after AK Press, you did PM Press. And it got so fucking huge. I was going through bookstores. I was seeing it everywhere, library, at college, everywhere. The PM Press, how did it get so huge so fast with the PM Press? It just went like everywhere, the PM Press book.
Well, PM was started by three people that left AK. Myself, Craig, and this guy called Dan Du. Meaning that, you know, AK started when I was a little kid, you know, when I was 13 or whatever. And by the time PM started, I was, I don't know, I'm trying to think how old I am. I was in my 40s. I think PM started 11 years ago.
Oh, okay.
So I'd have been 42 at that point. I think.
You know what? Right. Yeah, it was because
actually I might be 54 now. I don't know. I'm in my mid 50s anyway. One of the two, 53 or 54 at this point. Meaning, by the time we started PM, we'd spent literally decades doing this kind of stuff, and so we kind of knew what we were doing. To me, the production of literature, the production of stuff, once you know what you're doing, is relatively easy. To me, and the same is true 30 or 40 years ago, to me, the challenge is not the production. I mean, if you know what you're doing, you can produce good-looking, professional-looking, well-edited, whatever material. To me, the challenge has always been the distribution.
Right.
And that's partly why I'm willing to go anywhere within reason, because that's the challenge. And so PM being more or less everywhere beyond AK is partly just because we know what we're doing. We've used those lessons and are applying them, I guess.
You do realize this, at San Francisco College, they have like a class of anarchism. And one of my coworkers, she brought this thick-ass anarchist book, and she told me she took a class. And I looked at the back of the book, it says PM Press. Did you know that?
No, but I would hope so.
It blew my mind because all the anarchist book went through the colleges, libraries, and everywhere. That was really amazing. Then when you were doing PM Press, I was in LA and we were doing Southern California anarchist gatherings. That's when I was really happy. I go, okay, now I want Ramsey to come down because events are bigger, things are more organized. Then you came down to sponsors our event, you came down to table and stuff, you came down to Southern California Anarchist Conference. But the thing is, a lot of the people don't know, even at that conference, and the organizers don't know that you were involved since the 80s and you were into punk rock and stuff. That's why I wanted to do this interview and all that.
Sure, but I mean, again, why should they know, and why? I mean, who cares?
I mean, it's historic. It's historical. All the stuff.
It's historical, but that's all it is. It may or may not be an interesting footnote, but
I just think it's amazing. A fucking punk rocker started all this. Even in the activist community, won't even know AK Press, PM Press is started by punk rockers. Even Craig, I haven't seen Craig since the 90s. He used to come down to all the way to Santa Ana, Orange County and stuff to table too. It's just really awesome. Okay, before I go to the next question, I don't know if you know this too. Even the speaking of punk starting it, Southern California Anarchist Conference, the original Los Angeles Anarchist Book Fair Collective, all punk rockers like Colleen, background punk rock, Ralph, background punk rock, my background punk rock, Joaquin, background punk rock. All our backgrounds punk rock are just amazing.
Well, but I think it's not amazing. I mean, it is. It may or may not be amazing, but to me, one of the interesting things about punk and youth culture is that other than probably the folk music of the 60s, punk music is the only youth culture which has a significant political component. And that kind of political component has more or less endured. I mean, now that punk is 40 plus years old, but the politics, that component of it is still there. And in many ways, again, it makes me laugh that punk is still one of the main kind of gateway drugs, or one of the main entrances, if you like, to radical politics. You know, people are still discovering Crass decades after. Crass broke up in 1980.
I know, that's true. Yes.
And yet people are still discovering them and being inspired by them or whatever. Again, I have all kinds of criticisms and problems with Crass and anarcho-punk. But as a gateway drug to radical politics, it's unparalleled in modern history. And there's no other youth culture or youth music that comes close.
Right.
So I mean, I do find that kind of fascinating and interesting in a kind of anthropological kind of sense.
Ramsey, we have some questions for you, because what I did was a couple days ago, I told people that I was going to interview you on my Facebook wall, and there's going to be some questions. I'm going to read you off, but hold on. Okay, so are you ready for these questions?
I am.
All right. Okay, so I'm opening my Facebook app right now. This is crazy. I'm using a computer and two phones. One is hanging over there. It's broadcasting live on Instagram.
You're considerably more technologically advanced than I am.
So I'm using a computer and two phones. Okay. So I asked people to ask you questions.
This is my cell phone technology here.
Wow, that's so cool. You're like the old school of the 90s.
I'm a fucking dinosaur.
That's actually good, because social media is very fucking addictive. All right. This question is from Byron Davis. Brilliant band. Saw them in Penarth, Cardiff around 1984, 85. Still listen to them on it. Cheers. Keep it coming. Oh, never mind. Sorry. That was just say he's brilliant band, not a question. Okay. Question from David Insurrection. I have 3 questions. Political Asylum sounds set you apart from a lot of your punk contemporaries. What bands were important inspiration when it came to writing songs? That's question one.
Well, as I said before, we were kind of this strange mix of both punk in all of its quite a wide variety of punk influences. I mean, probably I listened to a lot of American music, a lot of American punk bands, and so that was a lot of what I played to Stephen, our guitarist. So we were very influenced by Black Flag, by Husker Du, and Amoebics was the other band that he actually really liked that I played to him. At the same time, there's actually a lot of similarities between bands like Husker Du and bands like Rush. So I don't know, for you musicologists out there, they both use, certainly the period of Rush where they were kind of doing Moving Targets, Tom Sawyer kind of era of Rush. They actually use what's called open chords, which is what Husker Du used to get that kind of ringing, kind of metallic, melodic sound, where you lift your hand off the bar. And so actually, from a music standpoint, actually I know fuck all about music and can't read music and can't play any instruments, but I guess I have a fairly good ear. So I would compose kind of the songs in my head, and I knew enough to say, all right, make that an open chord or whatever to our guitarist. But anyway, there's actually a lot of similarity, of course, because it's all rock music. So basically, in effect, we like kind of melodic rock. And actually, there's not that much difference between Iron Maiden and whatever.
I gotta tell you something. I haven't heard somebody say Husker Du for many, many years. Wow, I'm blown away by that.
They're probably one of my all-time favorite bands.
Another one is Down Amongst the Olive Groves and Apathy are my favorite Political Asylum song. What are your favorites?
I don't know, really. I mean, I actually tended to like the. I don't know. I mean, so in terms of our musical influences, we were happy. Well, particularly me. We ripped off stuff all the time. So in Apathy,
like the riff
was me listening to Diane by Husker Du and trying to copy that chord sequence. So it's pretty much the same chord sequence. It's a cliche. It's 5-1-3 chord sequence. The original guitar solo in Apathy is note for note about 12 bars lifted from Sultans of Swing by Dire Straits. Again, to give you an idea of some of our influences. I mean, we ripped off stuff. We ripped off The Damned. We ripped off Public Image. We ripped off Husker Du. I mean, just stuff that we're listening to. Wow. One of our early songs was called "Trust in Me," and that is note, which again was written by me. That is note for note the bass riff of the beginning of Six Pack by Black Flag.
Oh.
Because if people that know Black Flag and Six Pack, it starts off going, I'm not going to try and sing it, but you'll know the bass riff, very kind of famous bass riff. But the rest of the song doesn't use that riff at all. And I thought, what a fucking waste of a great bass riff. I'm going to turn it into a song. So I say we kind of ripped off anything and everything. And because we put them into our influences, it just kind of turned into sounding like Political Asylum. But you could say the same from any rock music. It's the same chord sequences. It's just how they're played or whatever effects you use on them or whatever. So my favorite Political Asylum songs are probably Cat's Eyes, which was on that second demo tape, which I still can't remember the name of. Valium for the Masses. That was the name of the second demo. So I had a song called Cat's Eyes on it, which was dropped from the set, so our kind of live set fairly shortly afterwards. Fucking great song. And maybe System of War, which is one of our earliest songs, which is on that Core 7-inch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And finally, the last time we spoke, I asked you if you expected the Hippies Now Wear Black to be published soon. Do you have any updates?
Yes and no. The author of that, I don't think the Hippies Now Wear Black will ever happen. However, the author of that book, or that non-existent book, is writing a 3-volume history of anarcho-punk.
Right now?
Which will hopefully happen eventually.
Oh, okay.
So the Hippies Now Wear Black has kind of turned into a 3-volume history of anarcho-punk. There's no date on any of it, but the author, Rich Cross, is actively working on that 3-volume history.
Interesting. This one's from Greg Fenton. Some thoughts. What were your personal favorite political Asylum song to play live, and why?
Well, partly it'd be the songs that I really liked. And then the other reason would be to actually play live would be the songs which kind of seem to resonate with the audience, I guess. I mean, obviously part of being in any band is in part what you do is you feed off the audience. I mean, from fairly early on, we did our best to be really professional, meaning that we were there to put on a show, so to speak. And we would put on the same show, whether we were playing to 6 people, which sometimes happened, or play to 600 people, which sometimes happened. But obviously, if you're in a show where the audience are getting into it, that will affect, obviously, your kind of performance. So, crowd favorites would often be some of the faster songs that we did.
Wow. Did I just hear you play live in front of 6 people?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we played, well, I mean, in the DIY days, well, all of our days were DIY days. But, we never had a booking agent. We never had a manager. We never even had a roadie. We did it all ourselves from day one. But I say typically we were the headliner. But so what would happen would be someone would say, hey, I'm putting on a gig in my local village hall or my local whatever. Can you come and play? And we'd say yes. So a couple of times we'd turn up and there'd be 6 people there or whatever.
Oh my God.
And
that's dedication on DIY, playing part of 6, but from 6 to 600, that's wow, big difference. Question 2. Can you talk about the songwriting process for the band? Who did what? How did song generally come to be, especially as the lineup changed throughout the years?
So the vast majority of songs that we wrote, we were actually a very unproductive band. We were together for over 10 years, I think. And probably 3/4 of those songs were written in the first 2 or 3 years. As I say, our first demo tape had 15 or maybe more songs on it. So we wrote a lot of songs early on. And again, many of our songs didn't make it onto demo tapes or records. So they were typical. I mean, I'd already spent years sitting in bedrooms playing music with Stevie, Stephen, the first guitarist. So we'd spent not a lifetime, but many, many years playing music to each other and dicking around. And either I would pick up his guitar and he would tune it to E so I could play bar chords on it. Or often I would play on the bass because it's only one note at a time. Or I would write songs in my head. I'd come up with melodies in my head and harmonies and then work with the guitarist. I'd say, can you do this? And then can you add that? And can you do that? And he would make it sound good. Or he would come up with it. So basically, either me or the guitarist would come up with the original ideas, and then we'd kind of work on the songs together. Right. Over the years, that became, so as we became more of a full-time amateur band, we were never professional. It was never our living. But when we moved to Edinburgh, we then got a practice studio. We rented a place to rehearse in, a rehearsal studio, practice place, again, which we shared with many other bands. So it'd be like, we have it on a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday or whatever, and they'd have it on the weekends or whatever. Anyway, so we'd rent this practice space. That's where our equipment would live, the drum kit and whatnot, and our amps. So again, we'd spend hours and hours. We were really serious, so we'd just be fucking around in the practice space, and so come up with ideas, come up with different riffs, with whatever. And it then became more of a collaborative process because the drummer or the bassist would also add in parts or ideas. But I say it was primarily myself and the guitarist. And then when we got a new guitarist for the kind of second half of the bands, again, that kind of process continued with me and the new guitarist. And at that point, our drummer was probably the most kind of musically gifted person in the band. Our drummer could also play guitar and bass and sing and do everything. So again, we'd sit in someone else's bed, one of our other's bedroom. And again, we'd kind of compose and practice acoustically. So often we'd kind of compose songs that way. But we were very unproductive, partly because I used to find it really, really difficult to write lyrics. So a lot of the lack of productivity was because I just couldn't come up with words. Basically, the words always came last, and they were kind of dragged out of me because I fucking hated writing words, and took me forever.
If Political Asylum were to have stayed together for another couple of years and released one more record after How the West Was Won, what do you think it might have been like? Do you think it might have been more on the acoustic side?
I don't know. I mean, How the West Was Won was not really a real record. I mean, it's a real record and it existed. It was a 10-inch, and I think it had 3 or 4 tracks on each side. So basically, when we did 2 big European tours, one in 1987 and one in 1988. Big meaning the first one was 3 weeks in 87. The second one in 88 was like 2 months. And then in 89, we did our first and only American tour, which is how I first came to America. First discovered America. Basically, when we returned home from America, our guitarist emigrated to Holland, and our bass player emigrated to Australia shortly after that. So it became kind of tricky to do things. So basically, in effect, the band kind of more or less broke up. So us starting to do more acoustic stuff was partly because we kind of liked folk music anyway, but it was an easy way to do things without a drummer.
Right.
And partly we would occasionally go to Europe to where our guitarist now lived, meaning me and the drummer. And then we got a European bass player. And so we'd occasionally do some gigs or do some recording there. But we weren't really, after 1989, we weren't really or 1990, say, when they all kind of moved, we were not really a functioning band anymore. So How the West Was Won was just kind of this weird kind of cobbling together of some stuff that we'd recorded basically in Europe on a couple of different trips. One of which was this acoustic session that was recorded live on a Dutch radio station. And then the studio tracks were on 2 different trips into recording studios to record some stuff. And there's only 3 songs, I think. So, I mean, I don't think we'd have gone anywhere because we'd already, in effect, broken up. We got together a few times to do some recording. We did a couple more European tours. And that was that, really.
Looking back, which of your old lyrics are you the most proud of?
I'm not sure I'm that proud of any of them. I mean, I think, I always find it incredibly difficult to write words. I've always hated writing. I still fucking hate writing. I think part of the problem of why I hated it is because when you look at words just as words, they're usually pretty embarrassing and pretty cliched because it's difficult to say in a few words. It's difficult to have nuance, to have complexity, to have sophistication. I mean, I'm not a great poet. I'm not even a fan of poetry. So I think looking back, I think the words are okay. I wouldn't say I'm proud of them. I'm also not horribly embarrassed by them, or at least most of them. I think they just are what they are. They're a teenager's attempt to write something meaningful, but they're written in the context of making music. And I don't think you can divorce the lyrics from the music. I mean, one of the fascinating things to me about music is that I think music has not only the power to move people, irrespective of the lyrics, but music itself can and is political. The act of making music and of performing music and is and can be political in itself. To give you an example, most people would argue, without question, that jazz, particularly in its formation, and then particularly in its iteration in the kind of 50s and 60s, was the music of black liberation. No argument there. Typically, it's got no fucking words. So hence, music can be a radical liberating force in of itself. Equally, as I say, one of the bands that kind of moved me the most and inspired me the most was Husker Du. If you actually look at their words, they're kind of reactionary assholes, actually. They're definitely not progressive in any way, shape, or form. They were undoubtedly, for a short while, a member of that kind of DIY underground community. But what they were singing about, and most of their actions, shall we say, beyond that generic DIY community, were, borderline reactionary. Doesn't matter. They were actually this inspiring force. I'll give you another example of the contradictions of music. Again, everyone would argue, and I would agree, that James Brown saying in 1971, "I'm black and I'm proud," was a kind of revolutionary statement. James Brown was a proud fucking Nixon supporter.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, wow. I didn't even know that.
He voted for Nixon. He championed Nixon. He was a fucking right-wing asshole.
Really? Wow.
Politically.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's no contradiction with him saying, "I'm black and I'm proud," and that being a revolutionary act. So I'm saying music in itself can be radical and revolutionary, but you can't take music out of that context.
Wow. Sorry, I'm shocked to hear this right now, that James Brown was a Nixon supporter. I've never heard that before.
Consistently.
Wow. That's... I feel like
he then went on to support Reagan and whatever. I mean, this guy's a fucking right-wing asshole.
That's crazy. Okay.
This one, putting aside all the Me Too stuff about James Brown, of course.
Okay. This is not a question. This is from Michael from San Diego. He's the singer from Cheap Sex. He used to be in Virus. Not the UK Virus, American band Virus. They're pretty big. But yeah, singer from Cheap Sex, Michael. He said, love political asylum. That's a comment for him. Okay, next question is from Jody Reyes. Oh, this one's interesting. Ask him what PM stands for in the PM press. What does PM stands for?
The honest answer is that PM stands for a collective failure of the imagination, meaning we really couldn't think of anything. So as I said, PM started because the few people left AK, including myself. AK, as some of you may know, is my mother's initials. And Canaan, which is where it comes from. Wow. And so it's named after my mother. At the same time, I thought it was pretty clever because it was a suggestive set of initials in that if people wanted to impugn radical motives, you know, my mother's name is not Kalashnikov. Let's put it that way. But, you know, so AK is a great name in that people can, if people want to think it stands for anarchy or whatever the fuck, they can. At the same time, initials are not going to put off people who don't know what it means. If you called a publishing company, we are going to fucking get you capitalist bastards, that would probably put certain people off.
Right.
So when we started PM, we brainstormed literally, we had lists of like several hundred names. Now, of course, PM started in the end of 2008. Or maybe round about then. Now, of course, this is full on internet age, 2008. So every name that we thought of was already taken, in that there was already a website called that, or there was already a bookstore in fucking Massachusetts called that, or whatever. So we brainstormed literally hundreds of names, and they were all, as I say, taken. So we just thought, fuck it, we'll just use the AK method and just use a suggestive set of initials.
Wow.
And people could read into it whatever the fuck they like.
That's very interesting, because all this time I thought AK Press, AK students with the AK gun, right? AK.
A Kalashnikov, yeah.
I don't know, but that's, thanks for explaining all that with PM and stuff.
AK is Ann Canan, my mother.
Okay, thank you. Next one is from Gregory Samza. My question is, what were the challenges around organizing AK Press in a small town like Stirling in Scotland? How Ramsey as an individual as well as his group managed to overcome those challenges?
So for the entire time, AK was just me for the first 10 years. So there was no challenge in terms of organizing because it was just me. The challenge came, and by this time I was living in Edinburgh, the challenge came of if you want to grow, you can't do everything yourself. Even if you're a full-time dedicated revolutionary like myself, you can't do everything. So I'd met a bunch of, through my kind of political work, political organizing, I was in contact with a bunch of folks. Again, this is in Edinburgh. It was actually largely people that I'd met through the anti-poll tax struggle, which I was involved with. And there was a brief moment where a bunch of us got together to maybe start a bookstore in Edinburgh. So there was me and a couple of other of these comrades of mine. And that bookstore idea fell through. Didn't last very long. But three of the people that were involved in trying to put together that bookstore idea said, why don't we, and I was looking for other folks to join me, AK. So I think there was 3 or 4 of us became AK when it was more than just me. And at that point, I set it up as a workers' collective. And I believe this was in 1990. And it's been a workers' collective ever since. And in fact, one of the people that joined when it became more than just me, a woman called Alexis in Edinburgh, is still there. Is still doing AK in Scotland, in Edinburgh.
Wow, that's cool. Okay, I got a text yesterday from your friend, Chris from Los Angeles, Chris Indie Media, who does 90.7 FM KPFK.
Chris is a good one.
He has two questions for you. I'm just laughing because there's a picture of him trying to solve a subhuman puzzle. Look how fucking big it is. That's how we're just laughing because there's a fucking huge puzzle of subhumans. Like it looks like 500 pieces or something. Okay.
So I think the subhumans is a 1,000-piece puzzle.
Oh, oh my gosh! Because I'm just looking at the picture. I was like, wow, he has a lot of things to do. Okay. Question 1 from Chris: is punk still relevant?
I mean, the perennial debate, of course, has been for the last 40 years of what is punk. So, you know, in one sense, I don't care. Punk is many things to many people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, again, being part of the Edinburgh punk scene, I didn't like the Exploited.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't like me, even though they didn't actually know who I was.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, for a while, me and Watty of the Exploited lived around the corner from each other in Edinburgh, and I'd pass him in the street. Long time after he'd threatened to, you know, kill me if he ever saw me, but given that he didn't know who I was.
You guys lived corner from each other back then?
But I would argue, there's no argument that the Exploited were a punk band. Right? There's no argument there. But the Exploited were completely against everything that I stood for. So that's what I'm trying to say is, what is punk? And you'll get 100 different answers to what punk is. If you can give me an answer of what punk is, then I would be able to answer, is it still relevant or not? Punk still exists as a genre of music. I still love that genre of music. And I still listen to it for pleasure. And I still listen to it for nostalgia. And I still listen to it occasionally for inspiration. And it gets me worked up, and it gets me angry, or it gets me inspired, or whatever. You know, I use punk rock lyrics, you know, at my wedding. It was my wedding vows. So, I mean, is punk still relevant? I don't know.
That's Chris's question. Fucking Chris, man. Okay. No, question 2. What do you think about hip-hop roles in politics?
About what, sorry?
What do you think about hip-hop roles in politics?
Hip-hop roles in politics?
Yeah, that was his question. Question number 2. From Chris, not me. This was from Chris.
I know considerably less about hip-hop than I know about punk. Again, my interest has always been, I'm interested in pursuing the kind of radical elements of any culture or youth culture. And my interest is to try and help magnify those elements and support those elements. So I know very little about hip hop. I do know that over the years, there has been some elements of hip hop that have been explicitly radical and political. You know, personally, I think Public Enemy, I don't like the music. I don't like the delivery or whatever. But I would argue that Public Enemy, again, this would have been what, in the late 80s, were a very political band, and they had some great lyrics, and they had some great whatever. The same would be with Ice-T. Had some great lyrics and had some great whatever. I think NWA's song "Fuck the Police" is a great song. As far as I'm aware, though, the members of NWA and the rest of the lyrics and the rest of their songs are reactionary garbage. But again, to me, it's like the political elements in any culture are few and far between. Same could be true of punk. Again, my interest is in, as I say, teasing out those more radical elements and helping to amplify them and whatever, expose them, expand them, whatever. If I personally liked hip hop, the same would be true of hip hop. If I personally like fucking rockabilly music, the same would be true there. It just so happens that I like punk and folk.
This is because of Chris mentioned this. I need to take this down from my wall. Since Chris mentioned hip hop, last year, I don't know if Chris knows this. Last year, we did an anarchist gathering in Berkeley. We got 2 hip hop artists for this. It was at Gilman Street, and PM Press sponsored this event. We were there. Hip hop artists. We had a original Black Panther came in and do a workshop and stuff. Since Chris mentioned hip hop, so I'm just showing this poster. This was from last year. Wow, Ramsey. Every time I try to do fucking interview for 30 minutes, it goes for 2 hours. I don't understand. This is crazy. We need to shut this interview soon. But I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to give all this information and questions and stuff. But would we ever see Political Asylum playing again? Or even if you can't get members, would you ever do covers of at least Political Asylum? Will we ever see that? No.
Well, and the rest of the band that are still alive live in Scotland or in Europe, in Holland, I think, still. And I live in Oakland, California. So the chances of us getting together, I mean, there was actually a couple of attempts to try and get together. We were asked to play a couple of big festivals in Europe or whatever. I mean, and eventually, it's not going to happen. I mean, I think trying to recreate something that you did, in my case, more than 30 years ago, is mildly embarrassing. I'm not the same person I actually love our music. I think I'm very proud in many ways of what Political Asylum did. I love the music. I listen to it occasionally, or my wife puts it on and plays it to my kids occasionally. And I actually think, this is great. I like it. I think, as I said earlier, it's difficult to take things out of their time and moment and kind of try to place them somewhere else. Like today is a very artificial process. So like when we used to play and perform, we used to go nuts on stage. We used to spend a lot of energy. We used to it was like a physical workout. We would all do stretches and we would, warm up before we played because it was a physical exertion. I used to warm up my voice. We were this weirdo band because, again, we typically play in venues that didn't have dressing rooms or whatever. We were playing in, small venues or, church halls or whatever. So again, it'd be the strange thing. It'd be in the toilets or in the corridor. You'd see these people like doing vocal exercises and stretching and because when we play, we'd go fucking nuts. Now, I'm not sure. Two things. One is, as you get older, your voice changes. I literally cannot hit some of the high notes that I could hit 30 years ago. I used to be, in professional terms, I used to be what was called a high tenor. I'm now more of a tenor / baritone. I only know this because I now actually sing in a choir. So literally, I can't sing as high as I used to because I'm older. And secondly, I couldn't do the physical exertion. But at the same time, so for us to perform the same songs, we can't do it in the same way, in the same intensity. That's not bad or good. That's just, but to me, it'd be weird trying to recreate that because we're different.
Are you done with singing then? There'd be no more? Or would you?
I still sing in a choir.
Oh, a choir?
After Political Asylum, since I've lived in America, I sang in a folk band for many, many years. Largely a kind of protest satirical band called Folk This. We mainly did like benefits and pickets and strikes and that kind of shit. And now I sing in a South African choir called Vukani Mawetu. Again, which I largely do because I like to sing, but also it's a political project. It's a political choir. It came out of the anti-apartheid struggle. So I love to sing. But Vukani Mawetu doesn't kind of go nuts on stage. It's a choir.
Wow. So all the stuff you told me from the 80s, but you didn't tell me too much about the 90s and all that stuff. But since you don't like writing, would you ever think about getting a ghostwriter and writing a book or anything like that about the whole movement and all that? No? Okay, just wondering. It's all, just forget it. Just wondering. Okay, before we go, what are some new releases coming up from PM Press? What's going on? Anything coming out? Any big project, or is it everything on hold right now due to the pandemic and stuff?
No, we're still publishing books. We're still publishing a lot of books. The best way is to just go to our website at pmpress.org. You can sign up on our email list. We had a whole bunch of crisis meetings at the start of the pandemic, and being in the Bay Area, I think was the first place in America to go into lockdown. So I think we've been in lockdown since second week of March. The book trade is currently fucked. The book trade is currently non-existent. But we're still doing our mail order. We're still doing various other things. So we're still functioning. We're still doing, there's 2 or 3 or 4 new books coming out every month.
Cool.
And we're pretty good as well.
All right. Thank you for this fucking long interview. Do you have any last comment before we go?
No. Thanks a lot for doing it. Thanks to people that wrote in, I guess. And I think I'm very flattered, and I say mildly embarrassed that people like Political Asylum. That's great. Thank you.
Ramsey, all the people are going to know that you're in a punk band now. No, Ramsey, I know when this is over, I know I'm going to see you because I see you at like different vegan event, animal rights event, green festivals and everything. I will run into you at another festival or another event because I always run into you. All right?
For sure.
All right. Thank you very much, and stay safe, Ramsey. Thanks for the interview. Bye.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.